Hey, I'm Brady.
Hi, I'm Merritt.
And this is the Team Radio Podcast. Welcome back to the Team Radio Podcast. This is our third episode, the French Grand Prix recap and review.
First, we're going to start things off a little different. Normally, we have our favorite Team Radio clip at the end of the podcast, but we realized that we miss out on all of the best Team Radio moments because just not all the Team Radios are out yet. So we decided to switch things up, and now we're going to start each episode with our favorite Team Radio moment of the last race. So in this episode, the last race was Baku, where Sergio Perez won. So our favorite Team Radio moment was at the end of the race. The drivers are driving around. They're going onto their team radio to talk with their teams. And Seb goes on, and he realizes that Sergio has won, and he goes, Felicidades, or Feliz Navidad, or whatever you say to Checo. I'm happy for him. And I found that very funny. So, Feliz Navidad, Checo.
God, what a great moment. Feliz Navidad indeed. Let's get right into the qualifying recap for this weekend at Paul Ricard. Right away in Q1, Yuki Tsunoda spun out, losing the rear end of his car. And as he was going over the warning strips, the iconic blue and red stripes, the rear end of his car was doing something really weird. It was kind of oscillating, shaking back and forth from side to side in a way that I've never seen before. And the commentators couldn't really believe it either. It was incredibly interesting. But anyways, that crash brought out a red flag, which temporarily paused Q1. Once it resumed, we had Mick Schumacher crash as well, causing another red flag that effectively ended the Q1 session. So we had 2 red flags in Q1 alone. And because of this, Lance Stroll was not able to even set a flying lap. So he finished qualifying in P19 next to Yuki Tsunoda, who of course crashed. Mick Schumacher crashed though. Why isn't he in the back row of the grid? Well, that's because when he crashed, he was effectively P15, which means Haas gets their first Q2 of the season. Not the way you normally want to do it, but Mick earned it, crash or not. Fernando Alonso and Daniel Ricciardo both made it into Q3. Both of the drivers have had up and down seasons to begin the year, but the veterans really showing out today. And Merritt, take it away with the top 10 order.
Yeah, so here's the top 10 order after qualifying, starting the race. We have Max Verstappen on pole, followed by Lewis Hamilton. Then in the second row, we have Valtteri Bottas next to Sergio Perez. In fifth, Carlos Sainz. In sixth, Pierre Gasly. In seventh, Charles Leclerc. In eighth, Lando Norris. And then rounding out the back of the top 10, we have Fernando Alonso and Daniel Ricciardo.
So let's move into our next segment, poles and pit lanes.
Our first pole is Max Verstappen, race winner. He had an absolutely fantastic race. It was an absolute case study in strategy, in technique, in talent. There was a very bold move by Red Bull that involved Red Bull trusting Max and Max trusting his engineers and the other people working at Red Bull. Now, Max started off the race on pole. In the second turn, he lost that leading position to Hamilton after going a little bit wide on a corner and ending up off the track. Now, we had Max tailing Hamilton for a while before he was able to pass him after Hamilton's pit stop. Now, Max is leading the race, and this is a race we all thought was going to be a one-stop race, a one-pit stop race. But very quickly into Max regaining his position, he decides to go for a second pit stop. And this completely changed the trajectory of the race. And he performed essentially what is called the undercut and what will be a theme of this entire episode. Once he got on his fresh tires after that second pit stop, he basically eliminated the possibility of Lewis being able to pit a second time, gained on him slowly, and then towards the last couple laps of the race was able to pass him and secure that win. And that now means that Max is 11 points ahead of Lewis after this winning race. But he also got the fastest lap of the race, which made that distance between him and Lewis go up to 12 points. And then on top of that, Max got driver of the day. So overall, amazing day for Max.
Yeah, I mean, you want to talk about a triple crown. How about race win, fastest lap, and driver of the day, right? Max was really doing it all on Sunday. You mentioned the undercut, and that brings us to our next poll. None other than Max's former teammate, Daniel Ricciardo. Ricciardo was faster than he's been all year, securing P6 in France, which is tied for his best result, but it was clear that this was his best race of the season. Ricciardo was the first person to really perform and undercut on the rest of the grid. We had Charles Leclerc pit early due to some severe tire issues, but Ricciardo was the first one to pit early due to strategy. Additionally, Ricciardo was a good teammate later in the race and let Lando Norris pass by so that McLaren could end up securing P5 and P6.
I always love seeing that teamwork between teammates. Now that brings us to our last pole, one that I'm very excited to talk about. George Russell!
Yes, George!
Brady, isn't this amazing? George Russell, a pole. Okay, so George Russell started off with a quality that wasn't awful. He got into Q2, but he got P14, which for Williams is okay, but, in the grand scheme of things, not great. Now, things got even worse when we started the race, and I don't know what happened. Honestly, George doesn't really know what happened either, but he had a very rough start, went all the way back to P18, and then, out of nowhere, we see him slowly creep forward, and he ends in P12. Now, this is, I think, George's best finish of the whole year. Even more important, it was all done on merit. George even said this on his team radio when he finished the race, and then he mentioned it again on social media later. But, there was no crashes, there was no yellow flags, there was no weird rain, wet race type of situation. He got to P12 based on his own merit and his own skill. And the fact that he was able to do this in a Williams car, just standing ovation for George Russell.
Yeah, it was truly unbelievable. When he was sitting there P18, his teammate, Nicholas Latifi, was even ahead of him. And the fact that he was able to go from that position all the way up to P12, nearly sneak into the points, it was fantastic. It was a fantastic drive for the young British driver who may soon be in a Mercedes seat. Speaking of Mercedes seats, let's move on to our pit lanes. And I'm going to go a little bit out of order here and talk about Valtteri Bottas because we're on the topic. Now listen, Bottas should not be in this category. We here at the Team Radio podcast are very firmly in the hashtag free Bottas camp. We believe that Mercedes is doing him dirty at every single opportunity. This team is letting him down. Whether it's terrible pit stops, insufficient strategy, favoring Lewis Hamilton, you name it, Bottas is getting screwed. He was quick all weekend long, even topping, I believe, 2 of the 3 practice sessions, and yet the engineers wouldn't listen to him during the race. There was an already iconic team radio moment where Bottas was saying this needs to be a 2-stop. These tires aren't going to last. And he mentioned that a couple of different times, 2 or 3 laps in a row, getting towards the middle and the end of the race. But no, they kept him out. Valtteri called the 2-stop before anybody else in the top 4 did. But, of course, Mercedes kept him out too long as Sergio Perez and Max Verstappen were both at 1 point behind Bottas. Bottas was the only shield protecting race leader Lewis Hamilton from the 2 Red Bulls. But ultimately, Mercedes sacrificed Bottas's race in order to improve Hamilton's final result. At least that was their game plan, I believe. And I think Bottas deserves better than that, just based on how talented of a driver he actually is.
So our next pit lane is Ferrari. Yes, Ferrari. The whole team. Brady, this was a disastrous weekend for them in all aspects. Hard to watch. They just really struggled with this car. And I know they've been having issues with their tires because of the amount of downforce on their car, which makes them go fast, but it eats up their tires. And a common thing we kept hearing throughout this race was that everyone's tires were going a lot faster than expected, and that might have to do something with it raining earlier that morning. Of course, the track wasn't wet when they were racing, but, it changed a few things. One of the commentators mentioned something about, the rubber being gone on the track. I don't know what that means. But the track was not what people expected it to be, and I think that really hit Ferrari hard. Both of them qualified pretty decently. We had Carlos in P5, which is a great start for him. And we have Charles in P7, which we know we can do better, but still P7, not bad. It's a pretty good start. But then they end up P11 and P16. They have no points, and because of this, they have lost their place in the Constructors' Championship to McLaren. again, not what they want to see. Now, Charles especially struggled, and he struggled going back to what I was saying with the tires. He was the first person to pit this race, and he pitted way earlier than you probably should have. And it was just because his tires were so worn out, he literally could not continue on those tires. And that pit just really hurt him, and he was not able to make up.
And that brings us to our third and final pit lane, Esteban Ocon. Now, prior to the race, Esteban Ocon inked a new contract, which I believe secures him through 2024 with Alpine. But in his first race under this new contract, he put up kind of a stinker for really the entire weekend. For most of the practice sessions, he was okay. I mean, flirting with the top 10, I believe. He was in the top 10 for a couple of them, but when it came to qualifying, he was out-qualified by Fernando Alonso. He missed Q3, I believe qualifying in 11th, and he lost 3 places in the race to finish P14 behind a Williams. With the success that Alonso was able to have in this race, it really showed that the car wasn't what failed. I mean, of course, Ferrari struggled with tires, so maybe this also could have been a tire situation for Ocon, but man, it was just a bit of a letdown for an Alpine team that is really looking to make some headway against AlphaTauri in the midfield.
And of course, drivers can have bad days, and Esteban Ocon has really shown great promise in earlier races. But Brady, like you said, this race was just not for him. And that brings us to our next segment, the team recaps. And this is where we're going to go over everything that happened in all the teams in the order of their top finisher in the race. So our first one, of course, is Red Bull, with Max Verstappen in first position. And this is just proof of a hat trick by Red Bull. They have now had 3 race wins in a row. And this is the first time they've pulled this off since 2013. And these 3 race wins coincide with the 3 episodes of this podcast. So I don't know. Maybe we're a Red Bull good luck
We
charm.
may be a little bit lucky. Who knows?
Christian Horner, you're welcome. But yeah, like we touched on a little bit earlier, Max really had this ballsy 2-stop strategy that he pulled out last minute, basically repeated what Lewis had done to him earlier this season in Spain, and then back in 2019, I think, in Hungary. Maybe it's 2018. I can't exactly remember. But he basically just proved why he is the best driver, or one of the best drivers racing. I mean, Max is just showing us over and over again how good he is. That's not to take away anything from his teammate, Sergio Perez, aka Checo. Now, Checo has definitely broken this Red Bull second seat curse that we saw with Daniel Ricciardo when he left out of nowhere. And then when we had Pierre Gasly go in, and obviously that was not a good situation. And then Alex Albon go in, and again, this couldn't give Red Bull what they wanted. But Checo is giving them exactly what they wanted. Now, Checo, as everyone knows, is this tire wizard. He just knows how to maintain these tires, how to work them. It's almost become like a meme in the F1 community right now about how good Checo is with these tires. He was one of the last few drivers to pit. He maximized these tires all the way. He overtook Bottas, and then, because of all this, secured him spot on the podium in third position. So we had a double Red Bull podium on top of this win and this triple win. And then, just a little tidbit of fun, we had a situation with Max's broken mic where he went on to the radio and it was just... They're like, Max, we can't hear you. And then they tell him, they're like, oh, your next opportunity, can you move your mic? Like, oh yeah,
The guy's driving 200 miles an hour down the street.
Oh yeah, sure, let me fix my mic for you. But anyways, great day for Red Bull.
One more thing about Red Bull before we move on. These 3 wins are coming at exactly the right time as we head for the next 2 weeks into the Austrian doubleheader at what is known commonly amongst the F1 fan community as the Red Bull Ring. So this is a pretty good time for Red Bull to start getting hot. You know who's not too happy about the Red Bull Ring is our second team of the day, Mercedes. Lewis Hamilton, of course, finished P2 behind Max, and Bottas, unable to secure the podium against Checo, finished P4. And listen, the top 4 were miles ahead of the rest of the grid, but, in Bottas's position, P4 is not where you want to be. They were so close. The two Mercedes cars, I believe, were leading the race. They were in first and second for quite a few laps. I want to say almost 10. I mean, Lewis was driving absolutely amazingly. He was fantastic today, honestly, and his tire maintenance was pretty darn good, despite what you'll hear on his team radio clips of him complaining about his tire age and his tire wear from lap 5 on. But ultimately, he wasn't able to hold off Max Verstappen right at the end due to that two-stop strategy. And the engineers, listen, I said it once, say it again, the engineers did Bottas dirty, and it's pretty clear that a breakup between Bottas and Mercedes is imminent.
Free Bottas.
That's
all I have to say on this. So, our next team is McLaren. Amazing day. They are the best of the rest right now. They are easily the third best car on the grid, and that is proven in the Constructor Championship standings. And Lando was one of the few drivers that stuck with that one pit stop strategy while others had moved on to the 2 pit stop strategy. Lando fell all the way back to P15, but with this pit stop, with these fresh tires, he was able to climb all the way back up to P5. Now, Lando had very subtle climb. We didn't really notice it at first, and part of that might be because of the broadcasting that chose to focus on Hamilton over Lando. But this subtle climb was impactful nonetheless, as we keep saying, because it scored McLaren those extra points, put them ahead of Ferrari. And that is thanks to Daniel Ricciardo, who finally woke up and remembered who he was. He left Red Bull, he struggled in the Renault, he moved to McLaren, he struggled. He was outside the points, he was at the lower end of the top 10, but this Sunday, or last Sunday I guess, he woke up and he remembered who he was. Daniel was the first one to, besides Charles, who had to go in for that pit stop because he had those awful tires, Daniel was the first one to do it for strategic reasons. We had his engineers come on his call, his team radio, and say, pit to pass Gasly, who was in front of him at that time. Pit to pass Gasly. He pitted, got fresh tires, and he slowly started climbing and made it to P6. This is great for him. Great for McLaren. Both drivers scored great points, putting them ahead.
Yeah, you can't really ask for much more from a weekend for McLaren. I mean, their car was clearly quick and it was suited to the circuit. The tire strategy was on point with, Ricciardo doing the undercut, Lando lasting on a one stop. And I mean, the drivers really performed. They got the absolute most out of that car and now they're best of the rest. It was fantastic. Let's move on to AlphaTauri now. Speaking of Pierre Gasly, it was another really solid weekend from him who, listen, I think now is an appropriate time to bring up, I think he might be a top 5 driver in the sport. I'm just going to be honest.
Agreed.
That may be a bit of a hot take, a little bit early in his career to say so, but given the things that he's done with this car, it's been fantastic. Once again, he qualified P6. I feel like he's always in P6. Ended up finishing the race in P7, but I consider it basically a net gain because the only cars he was passed by were the McLaren, so he loses 2 places due to Lando and Daniel Ricciardo passing him, but he passed Carlos Sainz due to the Ferrari troubles and managed to secure some solid points. And I mean, when you're Pierre Gasly and you're scoring 90% of your team's points over the course of the season and your team is leading the midfield, it's hard to be too upset with 1 place lost in the French Grand Prix. Also his home Grand Prix. So good day for Pierre. Yuki Tsunoda, after his qualifying crash, started dead last, but worked his way all the way up to P13. Honestly, a really solid day for the promising rookie. He had a pretty solid recovery from what was an absolute disaster on Saturday. I mean, Tsunoda's shown promise all season, and it was good to see that again on Sunday, even though he didn't score any points.
And just earlier, we were praising Daniel Ricciardo for waking up and going from P10 to P6, which is, again, great. 4 spots made up. But here's Yuki making up 7 spots. Props to the guy. Our next team is Alpine. Now, today was a bit of an up and down for the Frenchmen, or the French team, I should say. Home Grand Prix, wanted to pull something good out for the French country, for their fans, but it just wasn't anything too special today. Alonso started P9 and finished P8, so made up a spot, got some extra points. He debated a 2-stop strategy, but ended up continuing with the 1-stop strategy and just slowly worked his way up into the points. So, good day for Alonso, not particularly impressive. And then Ocon, as we already touched on, struggled a lot. He lost places and ended up in P14 and just seemed a little off pace the whole weekend. I mean, we talked about him enough already in our pit lane segment, so I won't touch on it too much more, but I really hope that we can see Ocon bring it back the next 2 weekends because I really do think he has it in him.
And there's a lot of rumors about that second Alpine seat going into next season, whether it's Alonso or I guess now Ocon after his new contract will be holding the first seat. But a 40-year-old Fernando Alonso is really just killing it so far, especially the past couple Grand Prix. Anyways, let's move on to our next team, Aston Martin. Lance Stroll, of course, wasn't able to set a flying lap in qualifying, started P19, but made his way all the way up to P10. Unbelievable. You talk about Yuki Tsunoda making up 7 spots. How about Lance Stroll making up 9? Starting 19th, working his way through all the back markers, all the traffic to get into the points. Once again, Aston Martin pitted really late. They were the final 2 cars to make their first pit stops. Stroll pitted on lap 34 and Sebastian Vettel pitted on lap 37. Some fantastic tire management from those two. Both of them, I believe, I know at least Vettel did, Stroll might have as well, pitted after Max Verstappen's second stop. So Verstappen made his first stop and then performed an undercut before Stroll or Vettel even pitted the first time. The only pit stop to occur after these 2 pits for Aston Martin were Charles Leclerc's mysterious second pit stop, which happened on lap 38. And that sunk him, of course, to the low teens and effectively ruined his race. But we're talking about Aston Martin right now. This was a great race from Stroll, and Aston Martin is going to need more races like this from Stroll in order to catch AlphaTauri. Because you know what? Their lead driver, yeah, I said it, lead driver Sebastian Vettel is performing. You talk about a podium finish in Baku. Now in this week, Seb qualifies P12, I believe the same position that he did the prior race, and again works his way into the points. Seb was P9, and as I mentioned before, Stroll was P10. And honestly, this Aston Martin duo is really starting to grow on me.
Me too.
You look at this tire management, my goodness, I feel like I'm a broken record talking about how late they're pitting in these races. But not only is that a strategy that's good in terms of, undercutting versus overcutting, blah, 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 but it's actually working for the drivers as well. I mean, Sebastian Vettel's fastest lap was the second to last lap in the race. And believe it or not, it was faster than any lap Lewis Hamilton had for the entire Grand Prix. Aston Martin's tire strategists have figured it out. The drivers are starting to figure out their cars. Now, they need consistent qualifying performances to get them some good points at the top of the midfield.
Now, Brady, can I tell you something?
Please do.
I like Stroll as a driver now.
Good.
Big breaking news.
Good.
But as a driver,
Good.
I am kind of a Stroll fan now. I wasn't really interested in him before, but these last couple races have been very good for Stroll, and I'm shocked. People always gave him a bad rep for being a pay driver. He has Papa Stroll come in here and get him on to Formula One, but these last couple performances are really proving that Stroll has talent and that he deserves to be here. I mean, let's not forget, sure, he DNF'd in Baku, but if it wasn't for the weird Pirelli tire situation, Stroll is doing amazing. Anyways, those are my 2 cents on Aston Martin and on Stroll in particular. That brings us to Ferrari, Brady.
Oh.
Listen, I don't really want to talk about them that much anymore. We talked about them in our entire pit lane segment. Let's just say this quickly. Very frustrating day for Ferrari. Maybe it was the tire pressure regulation change that happened post-Baku because of all those crashes and weird explosions that happened in the left rear tire. The car was okay in practice and qualifying, but then we got really mixed results in the race and it just didn't end well. Once again, Carlos lost 6 places and Charles lost 9, so not good. Please, let's move on.
Yeah, a day to forget. A day to forget for Ferrari, for sure. That brings us to Williams. Not a bad day for Williams. You had George Russell P12, his best finish of the season. That finish was enough to give Williams 9th place in the Constructors once again. Nice, because of course neither Williams nor Haas has scored any points this year. A P12 finish is enough to, take that top spot. In terms of qualifying versus the race, Russell made up 2 places going from 14th to 12th, and Latifi lost 2 places going from 16th to 18th. Latifi was pretty quick early on in the race. I mean, he worked himself up to P13, 14-ish territory ahead of George Russell before once again kind of falling behind, back to his usual position ahead of the two Haas drivers. Now, Russell passed Ocon and Giovinazzi. He was passed by Stroll, and he had a little bit of a battle with Yuki Tsunoda throughout the race. But, of course, as we mentioned, he finished P12.
Next, we have Alfa Romeo. Now, honestly, I couldn't tell you what they did during this race. Brady, I didn't see them. I didn't hear them. I literally, they might as well have not raced. I didn't know where they were. And again, maybe part of this was because of the broadcasters who choose to focus on other things and focus on certain people. But really, nothing of value really came out of this for Alfa Romeo. Giovinazzi, like Brady briefly touched on, went from P13 to P15. Now we have Kimi, start P17, finish P17. And just, they weren't able to keep up with the other cars. And, I mean, they were able to hold off both Haas drivers, but that's just expected at this point from any team. And they weren't able to hold off the Williams drivers. So, Alfa Romeo, I don't really know what to say about you today. I didn't really notice you, and it wasn't really impactful in any way.
Listen, I will say, as boring as their Sunday may have been, they did have Giovinazzi finish ahead of Charles Leclerc. I will say that.
That is true.
That's a sight to see, to have an Alfa Romeo, followed by a Ferrari, followed by an Alfa Romeo in the final standings. Now let's move on to our final team. Bottom of the rankings, once again, Haas. Oh, Haas. You know, Mick made it to Q2. Nice. The young guns are starting to deliver. But let's get into Haas, okay? Mick wasn't able to capitalize on his best qualifying ever in P15, of course, because of his crash. He lost 4 places, finished P19 as per usual. I mean, he's a young driver in a really bad car, all right? Mazepin also had a largely uneventful day. He qualified P18 as he was the slowest car who was able to finish qualifying with a flying lap, and he finished P20 as the slowest car who finished the race. You know, it's to be expected. It's pretty fair to say that he's the least productive driver on the grid. Mm-hmm. Although, let's talk about it. You had a bit of a Stroll epiphany on today's episode, and I can kind of feel something similar happening with me and Mazepin here. Now, Mazepin, I don't know him personally, but there's all sorts of things being said about how he's not a great guy. He's done some questionable stuff in the past, and I don't condone any of that. And of course, he's got his own Papa Stroll backing him as well.
Papa Mazepin, if you will.
Papa Mazepin. I believe his name's Dimitri Mazepin.
Oh, fitting.
But listen, ultimately, Mazepin has been not good, but he has not been the embarrassment that people claimed he would be.
All.
I remember preseason people were saying, the kid can't even drive one corner without spinning out. Mazza spin memes were all over Twitter and Instagram, anywhere you look, but he's not that bad. He will never be lapped 3 times ever again for the rest of his career. I promise you that. And I'll say it, based on performance alone, in the past 2 or 3 or 4 maybe Grand Prix, Nikita Mazepin deserves a chance in the 2022 Haas. I'm gonna say it. He does.
I will agree with that. I will agree.
And of course, same for Mick Schumacher, who's been better than his teammate for the majority of the season. I believe Monaco is really the only race you can point to say where he wasn't.
And again, I mean, yes, we have 2 rookie drivers who maybe aren't at the same skill level as other people on the circuit. But we also have to remember that Haas just really has an awful car this season. They said they weren't going to really do any development or innovation on the car. They were saving all their money for the 2022 season. And so when we have both drivers in the same team doing poorly like this, we have to look at the team as well and not at the driver's talent necessarily. So I'm excited to see where these 2 drivers end up next year if they both continue with Haas when Haas has a better car. So that brings us to our final segment of the day, the Drive to Survive moment of the race. Now this is the moment that we think is going to be portrayed in Netflix's series Drive to Survive Season 4 in dramatic fashion. And Brady, would you like to say what this moment is going to be?
Absolutely. Now, there were a bunch of, I think, relevant moments. And while I don't think personally that Netflix will spend a whole lot of time on this race in an episode, maybe there'll be a clip or 2 here or there. I feel like the most relevant moment to the show and to the season and to the off-season was the aforementioned Valtteri Bottas team radio segment where he says to his engineers, "Why the bleep does no one listen to me when I say this is going to be a two-stopper?" It was a moment of really intense frustration. I believe it came as soon as he found out that Max Verstappen pitted. He knew right away. This is what he had been saying for laps and laps and laps now. And I think the reason why it's so relevant is because it shows such a clear rift between Bottas and the rest of the organization. And I think if Bottas does end up leaving, which I think is all but guaranteed at this point, Netflix will point to this as a pretty pivotal moment in the development of that story.
I agree. And I think that, like you said, I don't think there's going to be a whole episode dedicated to this race. But I think moments of this race is going to be used as little segments in a greater episode that shows either, on the one hand, Max Verstappen's arc to, getting ahead of Lewis Hamilton.
Potentially being a world champion.
But indeed, we'll see, fingers crossed. But then also, now going back to Valtteri Bottas, this whole downfall with Mercedes. And I think this is going to be used in a whole montage of examples of Mercedes just overlooking Bottas, not listening to him, and just treating him to a different level of respect that they do with Lewis Hamilton.
And I'll just mention one more moment that we were potentially thinking of including in this segment before picking Bottas's team radio. You know how Netflix loves them some Daniel Ricciardo, right?
Oh,
he was the hero of season 1. He was the narrator of season 2. He was present in season 3. Who doesn't love the Honey Badger, right? A little bit of Danny Rick for everybody, okay? And of course, this was Ricciardo's best race of the season. So, if he can go on to really perform for McLaren for the rest of the season, I feel like this is definitely a turning point for him and one that Netflix will focus on for sure.
Yo, they're going to call it The Comeback Kid 2.
Oh, yes, please. I'm all about it. So stay tuned for our next team radio segment for next week. That'll be at the beginning of next week's episode. Coming up, this was the first race, I believe, in a triple header. We have this weekend's race followed by the 2 Austrian Grand Prix. So stay tuned for those episodes. My name is Brady.
And I'm Merritt.
Bye-bye.
Beep, beep.